It was 11:42 p.m. Eastern Time, and the radar floor of Chicago Center was the quietest loud place in the world. 17 controllers sat at their stations, each one surrounded by the soft electronic hum of screens and the occasional crackle of radio frequency, and yet the silence between all of that noise was the kind of silence that sits in your chest like a stone. Anya Petrova had been sitting at the secondary console in the back corner of the room for 6 hours. She had drunk 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold before she touched them. She had filled 4 pages of a notepad with calculations that nobody had asked her to make. And she had watched Gerald Marsh run the floor with the quiet, total authority of a man who had long ago stopped questioning whether he was right about anything. Anya was 23 years old. She had come to America from Kiev 4 years ago with a duffel bag containing 3 changes of clothes, a battered textbook on aeronautical physics, and a photograph of her father in his Soviet-era flight uniform, standing in front of a Antonov An-24 turboprop with the specific pride of a man who believed that the sky was the only place where the world made complete sense. Her father, Mikhail Petrova, had been a commercial pilot for 11 years before a catastrophic systems failure over the Carpathian Mountains had taken his aircraft down in 1999. The official investigation had later revealed that a junior ground technician had flagged an anomaly in the fuel pressure readings 2 hours before takeoff. His report had been received, stamped, and filed without being read. Mikhail Petrova and 41 other people died because someone in a position of authority decided that the person raising the alarm was too junior to be taken seriously. Anya had been 2 years old. She had grown up knowing that story the way other children grew up knowing fairy tales, except this one had no dragon and no magic and no rescue. It had only a stamped form and 42 coffins. She had not become an air traffic controller because of her father. She was careful to tell herself that, because she understood the difference between a calling and an obsession, and she did not want to confuse the two. She had become an air traffic controller because she was genuinely, almost frighteningly good at holding multiple streams of complex information in her head simultaneously, at seeing patterns in data that other people registered only as noise, and at remaining calm in situations that caused other people to freeze. She had scored higher on her ATC aptitude assessments than any candidate in the previous 8 years. Her instructor at the academy had written in her final evaluation that she possessed what he called architectural thinking, the ability to see not just where every piece was, but where every piece was going. She had read that evaluation once, folded it carefully, and put it at the bottom of her bag. She did not need someone else to tell her what she could do. She already knew. What she did not know, on the night of November 14th, was that in approximately 40 minutes, every piece of knowledge she had ever accumulated, every calculation she had ever made, every quiet hour she had spent watching and learning and refusing to be discouraged, was going to be the only thing standing between 260 people and the frozen ground of rural Ohio. Gerald Marsh had acknowledged her existence exactly once that evening. He had looked at her when she arrived, looked at the console she was assigned to, and said, "You're the trainee. Observe. Don't touch anything. Don't transmit on any frequency without my direct authorization. If you have a question, write it down and ask me when I have a moment." He had not had a moment. She had not asked any questions. She had just watched, and written things down, and waited. United Flight 99 had checked in at 10:58 p.m., routine and unremarkable. Boeing 787 Dreamliner, tail number N99UA, operating the red-eye service from Los Angeles International to John F. Kennedy International, carrying 247 passengers and 13 crew members. The aircraft had departed LAX at 6:15 p.m. local time, which meant it was now approaching its 4th hour of flight, cruising at 38,000 feet over the American Midwest at approximately 560 miles per hour. Everything was normal. The transponder signal was clean. The flight path was exactly where it was supposed to be. Captain Daniel Rourke had checked in with a voice that was steady and professional and gave absolutely no indication that he had been awake for 19 consecutive hours. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner is, by almost every engineering measure, a miracle of modern aviation. It was the first commercial aircraft in history to be built primarily from carbon fiber composite materials rather than aluminum, which made it approximately 20% lighter than comparable aircraft and dramatically more fuel efficient. Its engines, twin General Electric GEnx turbofans, were capable of generating 76,000 pounds of thrust each, enough to push 250 tons of aircraft and passengers through the sky at near-sonic speeds. Its fly-by-wire control system meant that instead of physical cables connecting the pilot's control inputs to the aircraft's control surfaces, every command was transmitted electronically, processed by a suite of onboard computers, and executed with a precision that no purely mechanical system could match. The 787 had redundancies built upon redundancies. It had backup systems for its backup systems. Boeing's engineers had anticipated virtually every failure mode they could imagine and designed around each one. What they had not fully anticipated, or at least had not adequately protected against in the fuel system architecture of the early production variants, was a specific type of contamination that could occur when certain fuel additives interacted with a particular polymer compound used in the fuel line fittings under sustained low-temperature, high-altitude conditions. This contamination did not block the fuel lines immediately. It did not trigger any dramatic warning. What it did, slowly and invisibly over a period of several hours, was coat the interior surfaces of the fuel injector nozzles with a microscopic crystalline residue that progressively restricted fuel flow with a consistency so gradual that the engine management computers interpreted it not as contamination but as a slow, unremarkable variation in atmospheric fuel efficiency. The computers adjusted. They compensated. They kept the engines running. And they did not flag a warning, because from the perspective of the computers, nothing was wrong. The engines were producing the commanded thrust. The fact that they were doing so by consuming fuel at a rate that was quietly, mathematically unsustainable was a conclusion that required a level of cross-system analysis that the onboard computers were not programmed to perform. Captain Daniel Rourke would have caught it. On a normal night, with a rested mind, he would have glanced at the fuel flow indicators against the consumption projections and noticed the discrepancy within minutes. Daniel Rourke was an exceptional pilot. He had 22,000 flight hours. He had managed an engine fire over the Pacific, a pressurization failure over the Atlantic, and a hydraulic system partial loss on approach to Denver, and in each case he had been calm, methodical, and correct. But that was Daniel Rourke with 8 hours of sleep and a clear head. The man sitting in the left seat of United Flight 99 on the night of November 14 had been awake since 4:45 that morning, had spent the intervening hours managing a scheduling dispute, completing mandatory simulator training, attending a union safety briefing, and then operating a full transcontinental flight. His brain was running on chemical fumes. The specific cognitive function that fatigue degrades first and most severely is not reaction time or motor skill. It is the ability to notice what you are not looking for. Daniel Rourke was looking at what his instruments were telling him. He was not noticing what they were not telling him. First Officer Marcus Webb was asleep. Not officially. Officially he was monitoring systems. In reality his eyes had been closing for the past 40 minutes in slow, rhythmic intervals that were getting longer each time, and at 11:09 p.m., when the first engine management computer began generating a suppressed internal fault log that should have triggered a crew advisory, Marcus Webb's eyes were fully closed and his breathing was the slow, deep breathing of a man who was simply gone. On the radar floor in Chicago, Anya noticed the flight at 11:21 p.m. She noticed it because of a number. The transponder data for Flight 99 included altitude, speed, heading, and an aircraft identification squawk code, and when she looked at the altitude readout she saw that the aircraft had descended 200 feet in the previous 6 minutes. 200 feet over 6 minutes was not an emergency. It was barely a fluctuation. It was the kind of variation that happened constantly in commercial aviation due to atmospheric pressure changes, wind shear, and minor autopilot corrections. Every other controller in the room saw that number and processed it as noise. Anya wrote it down. She wrote it down because something in the pattern of it felt wrong to her in a way she could not immediately articulate. The descent was too smooth. Normal atmospheric variation produced small corrections and counter-corrections, a gentle oscillation around the target altitude. This descent was linear. The aircraft was not drifting and correcting. It was sinking, slowly and steadily, in a way that suggested not atmospheric variation but a genuine, sustained reduction in thrust. She looked at the fuel data that was included in the flight's filed plan. She did a calculation on her notepad. She looked at the clock. She wrote down a number and then looked at it for a long moment. At 11:31 p.m., the first engine on United Flight 99 flamed out. In the cockpit, the sound was not dramatic. It was a change in vibration. A subtle shift in the background frequency that both pilots had been feeling in their bones for hours without consciously registering it. The engine management computer triggered an ICAS alert, a red warning message on the cockpit display, and the alert tone brought Captain Rourke out of his semi-conscious stupor with the specific, disorienting violence of a man being dragged out of deep water. He did not know, for approximately 4 seconds, where he was. This is not a criticism of Daniel Rourke. It is a documented physiological consequence of being woken from microsleep by a sudden alarm stimulus. The brain requires time to reconstruct context. 4 seconds is a long time in an aircraft emergency, but it is also a very human amount of time, and Daniel Rourke was, at that moment, operating at the absolute edge of what a human being can do. He identified the warning. Engine 2, right side, flame out. He reached for the relight procedure checklist with hands that were not quite steady. He ran the procedure. The engine did not relight. The fuel injector nozzles were coated to the point where ignition could not be sustained. He tried again. Nothing. He told Marcus Webb to take the controls, and Webb, who had been shocked awake by the same alarm, took them with hands that were shaking in a way that neither of them acknowledged. Rourke declared a pan-pan on the emergency frequency. Not a mayday, not yet, because one engine was still running and the aircraft was flyable. He requested immediate descent clearance and diversion to the nearest suitable airport. Chicago Center acknowledged and began clearing traffic. Gerald Marsh took personal control of the sector. The floor shifted from routine to emergency mode with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this. And then, at 11:38 p.m., the second engine flamed out. The sound in the cockpit was not described by either pilot in any subsequent account, because neither pilot was capable of describing it. What happened to both of them in the following seconds was a phenomenon called spatial disorientation, specifically the vestibular variety, and it is one of the most reliably lethal things that can happen to a pilot in an aircraft. The human inner ear, the vestibular system, is extraordinarily good at detecting motion and orientation in normal, everyday conditions. It is catastrophically unreliable in an aircraft at night, in clouds, in reduced visibility, following a sudden and unexpected change in aircraft energy state. When the second engine died, the autopilot disconnected. The aircraft, now without engine thrust, began to pitch nose down as physics demanded it should. To both pilots, still partially in the neurological fog of fatigue and sudden waking, the pitching sensation did not feel like the aircraft pitching down. It felt like the aircraft pitching up. The vestibular illusion was complete and overwhelming. Both men, their inner ears screaming false information at their conscious minds, instinctively pulled back on the controls to correct what felt like a steep climb. They were pitching the nose further up. They were killing what little airspeed remained. They were, in the most precise and terrible sense of the phrase, flying the aircraft into the ground more efficiently than gravity alone would have managed. The fly-by-wire computers fought them. The flight envelope protection system registered the increasing angle of attack, the decaying airspeed, and the contradiction between control inputs and actual flight parameters, and it began generating alerts. Multiple alerts. Then more alerts. The cockpit was a wall of sound and light, every system on the aircraft simultaneously trying to communicate a different aspect of the same catastrophic situation, and the cumulative effect of that sensory overload on two men who were already cognitively overwhelmed was not clarity. It was paralysis. On the radar floor, Anya watched the transponder track of Flight 99 do something she had never seen before. The altitude readout, which had been descending at a controlled rate since the single-engine emergency was declared, suddenly jumped. Not down. Up. The aircraft was climbing. Without engines. The airspeed readout was dropping simultaneously. She understood immediately and completely what was happening in that cockpit, because she had studied vestibular illusions with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and she knew that the pilots were pulling back. She knew they thought they were falling when they were climbing. She knew that if they did not stop, the aircraft would reach its critical angle of attack within approximately 90 seconds and enter an aerodynamic stall from which, at this altitude and without engine power, recovery was not possible. She keyed her microphone. Gerald Marsh's hand came down on her shoulder before the first word was out of her mouth. Trainee. Off the frequency. Now. Sir, the pilots have spatial disorientation, they're pulling back on a dead stick, I need to. I set off the frequency. I have this. Marsh keyed his own mic. He gave calm, professional instructions to the flight crew. He told them their altitude. He told them their airspeed. He told them to check their instruments. What he did not do, because he could not see what Anya could see from her secondary console which had a slightly different data feed configuration, was notice that the aircraft's control surface position data, a secondary telemetry stream that was not displayed on the primary controller screens, showed that the elevator was being held at an extreme nose-up deflection and was not responding to normal autopilot reset commands. The pilots were overriding the computers with physical force. They were holding the yoke back with both hands. Marsh's calm radio instructions were reaching them, but reaching a brain in vestibular crisis with words is like trying to stop a flood with a memo. The brain believes what the body feels. Always. Every time. At 11:39 p.m. and 43 seconds, the aircraft reached critical angle of attack. The automated stall warning system, a device that produces a loud, repeated synthetic voice saying, "Stall, stall, stall," while simultaneously shaking the pilot's control column, activated. The physical shaking of the column, called the stick shaker, finally broke through the vestibular illusion. Both pilots released the back pressure simultaneously. The aircraft pitched forward violently. They had saved themselves from the stall. They had also, in doing so, entered a near-vertical nose-down attitude at 22,000 feet with no engine power and an airspeed that was increasing every second as gravity turned the aircraft into a very large, very fast, very fragile dart pointed at Ohio. The computers tried to recover. The fly-by-wire system attempted to execute an automated upset recovery sequence, but the sequence required engine power for the final recovery phase and there was no engine power, and so the recovery sequence got partway through and stopped, leaving the aircraft in a steep but no longer vertical descent, at approximately 18,000 feet, with the airspeed now reading 380 knots and increasing, which was approaching the maximum operating speed for the airframe and represented a structural risk that the engineers at Boeing had definitely thought about. In the cockpit, Captain Rourke did something at this moment that every subsequent investigation, every analysis, every aviation safety board review would cite as an act of extraordinary airmanship under impossible conditions. He stopped trying to fix everything at once. He let go of the airspeed. He let go of the altitude. He pulled back gently, carefully, until the nose attitude was approximately 15 degrees nose down, which was not good but was survivable, and he held it there, and he spoke for the first time since the second engine failed. He said, on the radio, in a voice that was quiet enough that the controllers had to turn up their receivers, "Chicago Center, United 99. Both engines out. We are in an uncontrolled descent. We are attempting to manage the aircraft. We have approximately, I believe, 14,000 feet of altitude remaining. We are going to need somewhere flat." Gerald Marsh looked at his screen. He looked at the radar track of United 99, which showed the aircraft descending through 17,500 feet at a rate that his experience told him meant it had perhaps 4 minutes before it was below terrain clearance altitude in that sector. He looked at the nearest airports. The closest was a regional strip in eastern Indiana, 41 miles away. The aircraft, without engines, could glide. A 787 had a glide ratio of approximately 18:1 in clean configuration, meaning for every foot of altitude lost it could travel approximately 18 feet horizontally. At 17,000 feet, that gave it a theoretical maximum glide range of roughly 58 miles. The airport was 41 miles away. Mathematically it was possible. But the aircraft was not in clean configuration. It had been through a stall recovery. The control surfaces had been in extreme deflections. The airspeed was still high, which meant the crew was burning altitude to bleed it off. And the heading was wrong. The aircraft was not pointing at Indiana. It was pointing at a ridge line in southwestern Ohio. Marsh ran the numbers. He ran them twice. He got the same answer both times. He looked at his senior supervisor, a woman named Carol DeVoe who had come onto the floor when the emergency was declared, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was not words. It was the look of two people who have been in this room for a combined 60 years and who both know, in their bones, what the numbers mean. At 11:41 p.m., Gerald Marsh said, "Clear the airspace. All frequencies. Flight 99 is gone." Controllers removed their headsets. One man put his head in his hands. Carol DeVoe picked up a landline and began dialing. The standard language for what she was initiating was mass casualty notification protocol. She did not use that language. She just dialed. Anya Petrova did not remove her headset. She was looking at her screen, and she was seeing something, and she was running calculations that were different from Gerald Marsh's calculations because she was calculating something different. Marsh was calculating whether Flight 99 could reach an airport. Anya was calculating whether Flight 99 could reach the ground in a survivable manner, which was a completely different problem, and it had a different answer, and the difference between those two answers was a strip of highway in rural Ohio that she could see on her secondary navigation display, a straight flat stretch of Interstate 70 running east to west for approximately 3.2 miles through an agricultural area with no significant overpasses in the relevant section, and the aircraft was currently at 14,000 feet and 8 miles from that strip of road, and if she was right about the glide ratio degradation and the current energy state, the numbers worked. They barely worked. They worked in the way that a mathematical proof sometimes works, where you look at it and it seems like it should not be possible and then you check every step and it is, in fact, possible, and you feel something close to awe. She also saw something else on her screen. The secondary telemetry feed, the one with the control surface data, was showing her that the aircraft had stabilized. The elevator was at approximately 6 degrees nose down. The ailerons were level. The rudder was neutral. Captain Rourke had found a configuration and he was holding it. The aircraft was flying. Without engines, without computers fully functioning, with 2 exhausted men on the controls, it was flying. It was a glider. A 250-ton glider traveling at 290 knots with 13,800 feet of altitude remaining and a stretch of highway 8 miles away. She stood up from her console. In 6 hours on the radar floor, nobody had seen Anya Petrova stand up. She was the trainee in the corner. She was the observer. She was the girl who wrote things on her notepad. When she stood up, 2 controllers turned to look at her with the specific expression people wear when something is slightly wrong with a picture and they cannot immediately identify what. She walked to Gerald Marsh's console. He was on the phone. She stood beside him and waited 4 seconds, and when it became clear he was not going to acknowledge her, she reached past him and pressed the override button on the primary frequency transmitter. An alarm sounded, a rapid beeping that indicated an unauthorized frequency access, and every controller in the room turned to look. Marcia's hand covered the transmit key before she could use it. His face was a very specific kind of angry, the kind that is almost indistinguishable from frightened. "Trainee. You are done. Security is going to. Sir." Her voice was not loud. It was the voice of someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, that they are going to say the thing they are saying. "You are calculating for an airplane. United 99 is not an airplane right now. It is a glider. The glide ratio for a 787 in current configuration, accounting for the high-speed descent that bled roughly 18% efficiency from the coefficient, is not 18 to 1. It is closer to 14.8 to 1. At 13,800 feet, that gives them a range of 38.6 miles. Interstate 70 at mile marker 93 is 7.8 miles from their current position on a heading of 084 degrees. The usable straight section is 3.2 miles with no significant overpasses. They need approximately 2.1 miles of runway equivalent to land at their current projected touchdown speed. The numbers work. They barely work. But they work. The room was very quiet. Gerald Marsh looked at her. He looked at his screen. He looked at her notepad. He took it from her hand without asking and looked at the numbers, and his eyes moved across them the way a man's eyes move when he is trying to find the mistake and cannot find it. "The heading is wrong," he said. "They're pointed at the ridge." "I know. They need to turn. They need a right turn to 084, initiated immediately, at a bank angle of no more than 22 degrees to preserve energy, and they need to lose 3,000 feet in the turn to arrive at the road at pattern altitude. There is a way to do that. You're talking about an energy management descent spiral. On a 787. Without engines. The pilots need to execute a modified split-S segment. Not the full military maneuver. A 140-degree roll to the right, controlled pitch down to accelerate to 310 knots, then a 2.4 g pull through to recover to wings level on the 084 heading. It loses the altitude in the turn instead of after it. It gets them aligned and at pattern altitude simultaneously. Captain Rourke has the airmanship. He managed the stall recovery. He can fly this. There was a long moment. Outside the building, somewhere in the distance, a siren. The ordinary sounds of the world continuing to be ordinary. Gerald Marsh looked at Anya Petrova for a very long time. Then he looked at Carol DeVoe. Carol DeVoe, who had 30 years of experience and no particular investment in being the one who was right, looked at the numbers on the notepad and said, quietly, "She's not wrong, Gerald." Marsh took a breath. He picked up the transmit key. He held it for a moment. Then he handed it to Anya. She keyed the frequency. United 99, Chicago Center. This is Controller Petrova. I have your aircraft. I need you to listen to me very carefully. There was static. Then Captain Rourke's voice, exhausted and compressed and absolutely attentive, Chicago Center, United 99. We're listening. Captain, you have 13,200 feet and 7.4 miles to a landable surface. Interstate 70, mile marker 93, straight and flat, 3.2 miles. You can make it. But you need to execute a right turn to heading 084 immediately. Bank angle 22 degrees maximum. I need you to initiate a modified descent spiral in the turn. I need you to roll right to 140 degrees of bank, pitch down to achieve 310 knots, then pull through at approximately 2.4 g to recover wings level on 084. You will lose 2,800 feet in the maneuver and arrive at pattern altitude for the road. Do you understand? Silence. 4 seconds. 5. Then First Officer Marcus Webb's voice, and he sounded more awake than he had in hours, the way people sometimes become suddenly and completely alert when they understand that something matters. Controller, that is a split-S variant on a 787. A modified version. Yes. Boeing's never tested that on this airframe. I know. Another silence. Captain Rourke's voice, what is your confidence level? And Anya Petrova, 23 years old, 4 years removed from Kiev, first day on the radar floor without a supervisor, thought about her father's photograph. She thought about a stamped form and 42 coffins. She thought about a junior technician who had filed a report that nobody read. Hi, she said. My confidence level is high. Rourke said, initiating right turn now. On the radar screen, the blip that was United Flight 99 began to move. The heading readout ticked right. 10 degrees. 20. The altitude began to drop faster as the bank increased. Controllers who had removed their headsets were putting them back on. Someone had stopped dialing. The room held its breath in the way rooms cannot hold their breath but somehow do. The bank angle hit 140 degrees. On the telemetry feed, Anya watched the nose pitch down. The airspeed climbed. 295 knots. 304, 311. The aircraft was pointed almost at the ground for approximately 9 seconds, 9 seconds that everyone in the room who understood what was happening felt in a completely physical way, a tightening in the chest, a loosening in the knees. Then the G-meter reading on the telemetry spiked. Rourke was pulling. The nose was coming up. The heading was changing, swinging through the compass, 040, 060, 070. The altitude was dropping fast, 9,400 feet, 8,100, 7,200. The aircraft came wings level at heading 083 degrees. Altitude 6,800 feet. Airspeed 287 knots. Anya had calculated 6,800 feet. She had written it on her notepad. She looked at the screen readout and then at her notepad and they matched and she felt something that was not triumph but was close to it, something warm and certain. United 99, you are wings level, heading 083, altitude 6,800 feet. The road is directly ahead of you, 6.1 miles. You have it. Fly the aircraft. Rourke, we have a visual. We can see lights. We have the road. This was the moment, later, that Anya would return to in her memory. Not the landing. Not the aftermath. This moment. The moment when the pilot said we have a visual, and she knew it was going to be real. The next 6 minutes were not chaos. They were something else entirely, something that had no good name, a kind of sustained terrible precision. Rourke flew the descent with the absolute concentration of a man who has nothing left in reserve but is spending every last molecule of what he has. Webb called the altitudes. 5,000, 4,200. 3,100, Anya talked them down, calm and continuous, adjusting the glide path calculation every 30 seconds as the numbers evolved, the road getting closer and more real and more impossibly small against the mass of the aircraft approaching it. At 1,400 feet, Rourke extended the landing gear. The drag was significant. The glide ratio degraded sharply. Anya had accounted for this. The math held. At 800 feet, Rourke extended the flaps to 10 degrees. More drag. More lift. The aircraft slowed. The road filled the windscreen. At 200 feet, Marcus Webb said, quietly and to no one in particular, tell my family. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The main gear touched the asphalt of Interstate 70 at mile marker 91.8, approximately 1.2 miles east of where Anya had projected, due to a slight headwind component that neither she nor the aircraft's remaining sensors had fully captured. The touchdown speed was 167 knots, which was approximately 40 knots above the ideal speed but within the structural limits of the landing gear. The tires, subjected to that speed on asphalt rather than the grooved surface of a prepared runway, generated friction and heat at a rate they were not designed to sustain. Both main gear sets blew simultaneously. The aircraft dropped on its struts and scraped forward, throwing a rooster tail of sparks visible from the nearest town 3 miles away, and it slid for approximately 2,400 feet before the nose gear collapsed and the fuselage ground to a stop in a field adjacent to the highway. It did not catch fire. The engineers who designed the fuel system had, at least, gotten that part right. In the cabin, 247 passengers and 13 crew members were alive. The first emergency vehicles arrived 11 minutes after touchdown. The evacuation was conducted on the road and in the adjacent field, in the dark, in November, with temperatures at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the accounts given later by passengers described a strange, suspended quality to those minutes, as though the world had briefly paused to take stock of itself. A woman held her sleeping child and stood in a field in Ohio and looked up at a sky full of cold stars and felt, she later said, like she had been handed something back that she had not known could be taken. In the radar room at Chicago Center, nobody moved for a long time after the blip of United 99 stopped moving. Then Gerald Marsh put down his headset. He walked to the secondary console in the back corner of the room where Anya Petrova was sitting, and he stood there, and he did not say anything immediately. He was a man for whom words did not come easily, and this was a moment that was beyond easy words in any case. He said, the calculation on the glide ratio. The 14.8 to 1. Where did you get that? Anya said, the surface data showed a 6-degree elevator deflection and a 3-degree aileron droop from the stall recovery. I corrected the standard ratio for induced drag from those deflections. He looked at her for a moment. Nobody would have done that. I know. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man revising something. Good work, controller. He had called her controller. Not trainee. The NTSB investigation that followed took 14 months. It examined the fuel system contamination, the crew fatigue documentation, the fly-by-wire recovery system performance, and the air traffic control decisions made on the night of November 14. It found systemic failures at multiple levels, in the fuel quality certification process, in crew rest regulations, in the computer alert suppression logic, and in the training protocols that had left a controller of Anya Petrova's demonstrated ability sitting at a secondary console for 6 hours without authorization to transmit. It found no wrongdoing on Anya's part. It found, in language that was careful and precise and official and therefore took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in a sentence, that her intervention had been decisive and correct and had saved 260 lives. The Federal Aviation Administration subsequently revised its trainee authorization protocols, a change that allowed supervisors to grant transmission authorization to trainee controllers in emergency situations at their discretion. The revision was formally titled ATCS Emergency Authorization Protocol 2025-7. In the building at Chicago Center, the controllers called it something else. They called it the Petrova Protocol. Captain Daniel Rourke and First Officer Marcus Webb were both found to have operated beyond safe fatigue limits at the time of the incident. The findings were treated not as misconduct but as a systemic failure of airline scheduling and fatigue risk management, and both pilots were cleared to return to service following mandatory rest and psychological evaluation. Rourke gave one interview, in print, several months after the incident. He was asked what he remembered most clearly about the night. He said he remembered a voice on the radio that was calm in a way that he had never heard before, a specific kind of calm that was not the absence of fear but the decision to continue despite it, and that voice had given him something to aim at when there was nothing else. He did not name the voice. He did not need to. The stretch of Interstate 70 near mile marker 91.8 was closed for 73 hours after the incident for debris removal and road surface assessment. The Ohio Department of Transportation issued a statement noting that the highway surface had sustained significant damage and would require repaving over a 2,600-foot section. Local news coverage of the repaving operation noted, with the particular satisfaction that communities take in things that happen near them, that the patch of new asphalt was noticeably darker than the surrounding road and would remain visible for years. There was one element of the investigation that was never made public. A section of the final NTSB report, 17 pages in length, was classified at the request of the Department of Defense, citing implications for national aviation infrastructure security. The nature of those implications was not disclosed. Aviation reporters who filed Freedom of Information requests for the classified section received standard acknowledgement letters and nothing further. What those 17 pages contained, what connection they drew between the contamination event on United Flight 99 and whatever the Department of Defense found significant enough to classify, was not known outside a small group of officials who did not discuss it publicly. Gerald Marsh retired 14 months after the incident, as he had planned, with 32 years of service and a pension and a party in the break room with a cake that said, "Clear Skies, Chief," in blue frosting. He shook hands with every controller on the floor. When he got to Anya, he held her hand for a moment longer than the others and said, in a voice that was quiet enough that only she heard it, "You were right and I was wrong and I knew it when I walked away and I should not have walked away." It was the most he could give and they both knew it and it was enough. Anya Petrova passed her full certification 18 months after the incident. She was assigned to the primary radar sector at Chicago Center, the one that covered the high-altitude overflights, the complex traffic, the difficult geometry. She was 24 years old, the youngest primary sector controller in the history of the facility. She kept a photograph on her console, which was technically against regulations and which every supervisor who saw it chose not to mention. It was a man in a flight uniform, standing in front of a turboprop aircraft, with the specific pride of someone who believed that the sky was the only place where the world made complete sense. She believed the same thing. She just believed it from the ground.